It was a crisis that cost the Archbishop of Canterbury his job. John Smyth's physical, sexualised and psychological abuse of boys and young men was known at the most senior levels of the Anglican Church by 2013.
John, good morning to you and welcome to AM News.
Good morning, Elvis. Thank you for your invitation.
And yet, as seen here on South African TV, his reputation as a religious and legal authority went untarnished until Channel 4 News exposed him years later.
Mr. Smyth, Kathy Newman from Channel 4 News. We're told that you beat young men until they bled. Why did you do that?
I'm not talking about that.
We've been investigating what the Macon Review, triggered by our reporting, calls the lost years after 2013. Years where Smyth could and should have been brought to justice. Instead, we've discovered he continued to groom and manipulate teenagers and young men.
John Smyth's movements in South Africa are pretty much a mystery, and Keith Macon wasn't able to investigate them as part of his review, but we've been speaking now to multiple sources to piece together his movements here.
By 2013, Smyth was a pariah in church circles in the UK, Zimbabwe and Durban, South Africa. Instead, he'd settled here in Cape Town, where we've linked him to at least 4 churches. At one, we were told the leadership worshipped him. At another evangelical church on Main, elders were flattered this esteemed and charismatic QC wanted to join. It was their youth groups that interested Smyth the most. He was quick to set up his own.
I don't think that's a bit strange, that someone who's so new wanting to lead a group of men.
Dion Takpui attended some of Smyth's Bible groups.
Certainly there was respect, there was admiration. I knew there were people that looked up to me, the same way I did. I just thought this is a good guy.
We've spoken to dozens of young men Smyth met and mentored then in their late teens and early 20s, and what we've found is disturbing.
We now know that John Smyth would take young men to this exclusive sports club in Cape Town. He'd play squash with them, he'd have breakfast with them, and in between, he'd shower naked with them.
All of them have asked us to keep their identities secret. We've used actors to voice their words.
He would insist on one-on-one showers at the squash club. Definitely felt uncomfortable. And over lunch he'd bring up lust, porn and masturbation. Generally, his spiritual argument was God gave you a body, enjoy it, it's natural.
When some of the guys felt uncomfortable in the communal showers, John would suggest it was because watching pornography had made them sexualize male private parts.
I had this friend who showered in his briefs. John asked me, why does he do that? He said it's not good to be ashamed of your body, and he asked me to speak to him. I thought, why are you so concerned?
I was uncomfortable with the interest John showed in my sexual purity and whether or not I masturbated. On this basis, I argued with him and left the group.
It was masked as caring. He didn't beat around the bush. He'd say, tell me about your sexual problems. Then say, why did you do that to me? Don't do that. With judgment. After your mentoring sessions, you felt emotionally cracked open.
5 miles from the church is the pretty upmarket suburb of Bergfleet, where Smyth lived with his wife Anne. Here he'd have young men to sleep over.
The one thing that was odd now, I think about it, is that he came into my room to say goodnight. Even though the door was closed. I thought, okay, well, a closed door doesn't mean much here.
He'd also host Bible evenings that began in his pool, telling students in a WhatsApp message seen by Channel 4 News not to worry if they forgot their trunks because he had spares. Honouring God with my body was a repeated theme.
The topics will be around the theme of loving God with all our minds, souls and spirits, and honouring him with our bodies, leading up to our annual camp.
We retrace the steps to one of his camp locations, 2 hours' drive from Cape Town at a secluded cottage.
John Smyth posed a grave risk to young men, and some of the most powerful people within the Church of England knew as much. And yet we've discovered for the very first time that he was able, after 2013, to take groups of young men on weekends away, including to this cottage in the Western Cape, where he'd skinny dip with them as he had done 20 years before in Zimbabwe.
Smyth's camps in Zimbabwe were notorious for their beatings, but especially for what the Macon Review calls the suspicious and unexplained tragic death of a child in 1992, Guy Nuyachuru. His body was found by a gardener naked in the pool. And yet we know that as recently as 2016, Smyth would take teenagers and young men away, swimming naked with them as he had done there. But two Church on Main leaders told us that same year Smyth had even more worrying plans to take 7 to 12-year-old children away on unsupervised weekends.
They felt there was a need for this type of service, and he said he and his wife would be the house mother and father. We said we were considering it. Shortly after, a complaint was raised by a young man about the squash club and showers. We said absolutely no way he could be left alone with children. In hindsight, it is chilling to even think about.
In 2016, Church on Main elders asked Smyth about the conversations they discovered he'd been having with young men regarding masturbation. He reacted aggressively and, we understand, left the institution. Some of the boys we spoke to say they felt sad that their church had been misled. One told us he felt let down and disappointed he never got an apology.
If we look at the Smyth case, we can see many factors within the community and culture in which he operated that were conducive to this abuse, that were red flags. So, for example, the very rigid hierarchy, the deification of leaders. We're talking about an individual who was brazen and determined to continue his abuse of boys and young men.
Opportunities to stop John Smyth were missed by a litany of institutions, not least the Anglican Church in England, but in South Africa too. The Macon Review revealed that in 2013, the Bishop of Ely in the UK wrote to a prominent Cape Town bishop warning about Smyth's history and suggesting a joint approach to police.
It would appear that no information about the risk he poses to children and adults has followed him from the United Kingdom.
The office of the South African Bishop, Garth Council, replied, saying he'd take it up with the Archbishop of Cape Town himself, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba. What happened after that in those lost years has been much debated, with the Anglican Church in southern Africa plunged into crisis. One worsened when just a few weeks ago, one of the men it appointed to investigate stood back, himself accused of sexual abuse of a child. That investigation, released last night, found that the institution hadn't done enough to mitigate the high risk Smyth posed here until his death, that it hadn't warned other churches beyond its own, and it found that its current safeguarding practices were lacking.
I acknowledge that during Smyth's time in Cape Town, God's people were exposed to the potential of his abuse, and I and the diocese apologised.
The Macon Review, meanwhile, was highly critical of the UK Anglican Church and Justin Welby for failing to chase up the letter, describing a distinct lack of curiosity. One person, though, kept pushing during those lost years, a British victim of John Smyth. A known abuser continues a ministry of some sort, he wrote to a safeguarding officer in 2014, adding, there seems no way of checking up, getting a message through, or preventing further abuse. John Smyth, meanwhile, 6,000 miles away, continued his ministry unhindered.
Amelia Jen reporting there. Now, the Church of England has released a statement tonight in response to our report, stating that it is evident that Smyth was allowed to go abroad in the 1980s with the full knowledge by some in the Church of his abuse. This was wrong and should not have happened. But they also point out that the Anglican Church of Southern Africa's communication of the dangers Smyth posed fell short of what the circumstances demanded. Well, earlier today I spoke to the Archbishop of Cape Town, Thabo Makgoba, and I asked whether he was disappointed that the Church of England didn't take action against John Smyth sooner than it did.
They knew long before 2013, and the church should have taken action. It is painful. It is painful indeed, and it is very sad.
So as an institution now, will you apologise for failing to warn other churches about the risk that Smyth so clearly posed?
I failed, and the diocese failed to warn the church that Smyth told us he was going to, which is Church on Main.
That's an apology to one church, sir. Do you feel that as an institution, the church should apologise much more widely than that.
The church can apologize much widely than that, but in this instance, we have specifically erred and failed because when Smyth resigned from our parish, he wrote a letter to the then rector to say, I am going to a specific church. So he posed a risk to that particular church and to the churches around.
And yet there's something more worrying still in this report, isn't there? It says quite clearly there are still serious concerns about your safeguarding practices. And I quote here, it says in recent times, serious physical and sexual abuse is happening in your institutions, including church schools and children's homes. Do you accept that? And what are you going to do about it?
We've got our safeguarding, and so to speak, you are right, we've only started it in 2019.
But that's five years ago, Archbishop. The report states clearly these things are still happening now in your institutions.
Well, we are building safeguarding, and we will ensure that no one suffers. And in terms of Smyth, this particular case, we are relieved that this British expatriate who came to our shores, none of those cases that happened in Zimbabwe and in the UK have been reported here. It's a big relief, but you are right, our safeguarding processes can improve.
Well, you say this and you talk about trust, but frankly, why should people trust you? You were the man who said that Smyth hadn't counselled young men. You were quick to say there were no victims in South Africa. Do you regret saying that? And would you apologise now for saying that?
The inquiry has happened, and we have asked people to come forward. And
no, and I'm not asking about that, as you well know. I'm saying you reached judgment in advance of the inquiry. That is inexcusable, and you should apologise for that here and now, should you not?
I am basing what I'm saying on the inquiry, and no one came forward to say they were abused by Smyth so far.
Looking back on this, Archbishop, may I ask, are you disappointed that Justin Welby, on his visits to South Africa, in his communications with you, didn't flag up the danger that Smyth was, and that he knew he was?
Yeah, well, I am disappointed that the Church of England didn't really report as they should have after knowing for decades. And I am grateful that Archbishop Justin Welby took the responsibility. Yes, of course, it would have been wonderful if he had, because this matter is serious, and I would have not kept it in my chest. We would have acted.
Indeed. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.